Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 30th of September 2020, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish. Just in time delivery.
Absolutely. Now, we're going to start off with Tobias Ellwood, who was speaking in the House of Commons. This has been doing the rounds of social media, so you may have seen it, but I just want to break it down and actually have a think about what he's said here. So let's have a listen to the introduction.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to focus on the rollout of a vaccine, which may seem a little premature given we are contemplating a second wave of the pandemic and indeed further economic intervention. But a vaccine is potentially 6 months away. China is already mass producing a product. It's got another 10 others online as well. Oxford is heading into its phase 3 tests with tens of thousands of people being tested, as are other institutions around the globe. But the scale and complexity of this challenge is up there with the D-Day landings and indeed Dunkirk.
So that's Tobias Ellwood, MP, who we are going to be calling Lieutenant Colonel Tobias Ellwood, because of course he is an MP, but he's also a reservist for 77 Brigade, and that makes him a propagandist. So what else did he have to say? He went on to say that the mass vaccine rollout is enormous responsibility. Planning must start immediately. He said that I've written to the Prime Minister recommending that he consider calling on the Ministry of Defence to establish a small task force led by a senior empowered voice of authority. And in brackets, we've got what he was thinking there, me, let it be me. I absolutely believe that's what he was hinting at. And he said when you pause to consider what's involved, the logistics of shifting millions of refrigerated vaccines across the country, because Brian, there are no logistics companies around, there's no refrigerated logistics companies around, they're not shifting huge quantities of food or other biodegradable material around on a regular basis, are they?
I'll pause and say the irony of this is that military over recent years have been saying that the military need to learn from the private sector in how to conduct logistics, because of course across the country every day, as you're indicating, the big supermarkets in particular moving thousands and thousands of tons of products in a way that the military has not done since the Second World War, possibly the Korean War. So what he's saying is another twist on the truth, isn't it?
Absolutely. And he went on to say, developing a national database to track progress and issue the vaccination certificates. So we need the military to do this, to develop a national database to track progress and issue vaccination certificates. Now, he said that as if it was nothing. Nobody has actually asked about this issue of vaccination certificates. He was implying that it's already a done deal, but we actually need the military to help roll out vaccination certificates. I'm not aware of any sort of national conversation about whether we need those, but he went on to say this, which will probably have to be internationally recognised in order to allow travel. So, Brian, we're getting a very clear, if we say that Lieutenant Colonel Tobias Ellwood represents the deep state, which I believe he does, we're getting a pretty clear picture here of what the deep state is expecting as we progress through this alleged pandemic.
Mike, I said to you earlier this morning that, in my opinion, this is a coup. We're actually looking at a coup in progress in this country. There are some MPs now just starting to wake up and say we're not even getting debates in Westminster. There are some MPs saying, well, hang on a minute, you're not going to lock the country down again until there's been debate in Westminster. Now we've got this man, you've called him a propagandist, but it's worse than that, Mike, because this is propaganda being conducted through the British Army, through the military, and now it's being brought back into government with him like some little schoolboy saying, me, headmaster, choose me, in order to run what should be, if this was required. He's suggesting that this is now supplied and organised by the military. This is I'm not allowed to use that phrase, am I? I'm going to use it again. Unbelievably dangerous, because we are now looking at the military being brought into control of the country. This is a coup.
So he went on to say, now with the coordination of Whitehall departments, local authorities, the private sector, policing and security, as well as the military support to consider. And now your comment about it being a coup, of course, what's he talking about here? He's talking about the fusion doctrine. This coup began actually quite a long time ago. It was announced through the various defence reviews, and it was announced in 2018 that the government would be pursuing this fusion doctrine. It was announced under the auspices of the Theresa May regime, but of course that policy has not come from Theresa May herself or her government. It's come from Mark Sedwill and the people in the cabinet office around him. So we're talking about coordination. Just think about this. When we think about fascism in the Mussolini sense, for example, the coordination of Whitehall departments, local authorities, the private sector, policing, security, as well as military support. And when we're talking about security, of course, we're talking about security services there. This is merging these things together to a degree that is unprecedented historically.
Unprecedented and immensely dangerous, because we don't know. UK column, I think, has been the lead questioner on this. Who is actually running the country? It's quite clear that it's not being run via the Conservative Party. The country's not being run by Boris Johnson. You've mentioned the deep state. We're into the deep state, but this is a coup. Who is now controlling Britain? We don't know.
He goes on. The biggest challenge will be managing the transition period potentially up to a year. Now, of course, he's not talking about Brexit here. He's talking about a transition period with respect to vaccination, because he went on then to say, when parts of our society are liberated from COVID-19, and would like to seek a return to normality, and those who have yet to be vaccinated but are still subject to continued social distancing rules. And he went on to talk about priorities, who would get the vaccines first, NHS workers, teachers, and so on. But clearly what is being built here, Brian, is a demand for vaccination, because, of course, some people who have been lucky enough, in inverted commas, to get the vaccine will be allowed to get on with their normal lives to some degree, or to a greater degree. And those who have not been vaccinated will be continuing to go through this lockdown shenanigans that we're seeing, totally chaotic, not able to go to work, not allowed to leave their local areas, not allowed to go to the pub, and so on. So this is going to be, if what he's proposing here goes on, is going to be utterly divisive.
Well, that's a given, Mike, because the aim is to divide the country, because the underlying policy is divide and rule. Chaos in the country, antagonism between groups, people at each other's throats, people confused. That is clearly the agenda. And why do you do that? Because when the nation is in that state, you can control the nation. So Tobias Ellwood, very, very dangerous man here. In the chat box, somebody has said who's actually controlling him, and I think that's a very interesting question. He's not going to be the leader, he's the spokesperson, but clearly he knows what's coming.
Well, he's not the leader yet, but I think he wants to be.
Well, I'm going to say, yes, all right.
So he said the West was slow to understand the impact of this pandemic, the pace at which it moved through society, and its lethality. Well, we'll be talking a little bit more about its lethality a little bit later, but this is, his entire approach here is based on the notion that of its lethality. We would argue that it doesn't have one, not in the sense that he means anyway. So let's task the Ministry of Defence now, he said. Let's appoint a leader to plan, prepare for this complex and critical national project. And it was obvious that he was envisioning himself in this role. The new dictator.
Well, he put on a new school blazer, hadn't he? So he's little boy blue here with a very smart suit and his matching tie, and he's looking very prim and proper. He's a proper army officer in his opinion, but of course he's not. He's operating as a propagandist. But yeah, this is very immature stuff that we're watching, and I think that's part of the danger of these people.
So demands from people within the House of Commons to bring more military involvement. We made the point that Boris had announced more military involvement last week when he gave his address to the nation, that the fact that Birmingham was intending to call in the army to support door-to-door COVID-19 testing in their hotspots, and the fact that this was related to the drop and collect service. So the military coming onto the streets in a face-to-face role. Well, there's some interesting stuff going on. And if we head across the water to Ireland, well, first of all, let's just mention this, because this tweet was pushed out yesterday morning saying United Nations military vehicles shipped into Cork at 7 o'clock this morning. And as we see this person driving off the boat at Cork Harbour in the deep jetty there, we see a whole raft of UN vehicles. Now, we've got to ask what this is about, because, of course, the UN doesn't have a military, it doesn't have a police force. The way that it works is that national member states donate. Well, they don't really donate because they get paid for it, but they give services to the United Nations for peacekeeping and so on, and that includes equipment. So whether that equipment on the jetty there is coming back from a deployment, I'm not really sure. I have asked the Irish Ministry of Defence for comment on it, but basically this equipment comes under what's called contingent owned equipment, and this is the equipment owned and bought by the United Nations member states for peacekeeping missions. So whenever they come back from a peacekeeping mission, they'll bring that material, that equipment back with them. It includes things like armoured personnel carriers, as you saw there, but also things like catering, communications, medical equipment, field defence equipment, metal detectors, other handheld equipment, heavy engineering equipment, and so on. And basically, member states buy this and then get reimbursed at the going market rate by the United Nations for having and maintaining that equipment. So interested to see what the Irish Ministry of Defence comes back with on this, but still questions to be asked about what is actually going on there.
I was just going to add, Mike, and we are, I'm just going to say to our audience, we are aware that many of you are giving us information and asking us to report about the sudden influx into migrants who are coming into military or ex-military bases. That's occurring in Wales. We believe it's happening down there in Dover, I believe. We are following this and we are asking questions. And interestingly enough, a retired policeman said in relation to policing in Trafalgar Square that he didn't believe it would be possible for effectively foreigners to be brought into a policing role in UK. So we've paid attention to that as well. But we will say we are receiving very, very strange reports from people who are clearly seeing things happening in their locality which they have never seen happen before and they don't fully understand. So keep sending us the information and we'll do our best to look at it.
But back to Ireland for a second then, we have this report from the website Joe in Ireland, which is sort of one of these pseudo-mainstream alternative websites. Senator calls on the army to assist Gardaí following large gatherings in Galway. So my point here is, the reason that I've brought this up is because it's not just in the UK. We're seeing pressure for the military and the police to be operating together in these types of situations. And what this is actually is internationalist policy, which David Ellis has been talking about for a long time now. It is being seen most obviously with respect to the European Defence Union, where they are absolutely open about the fact, but equally NATO as well, open about the fact that they want to see a merging between civilian law enforcement and policing and the military. And this is not a happy direction to be moving in.
No, and we can ask lots of questions because we know in other areas, Mike, for example, we've got UN policy coming directly into UK policy, matters like education in particular. So UNESCO policy coming straight into schools with almost no interface with the Department of Education. So is it possible we're now going to another layer where the UN is having influence over, we'll call it policing? This is a possibility.
Okay. So what is Boris going to announce this afternoon? He says he's not going to announce anything, that today's live stream, he will be flanked by the Chuckle Brothers. Today's live stream will be simply an update for everybody, that there aren't going to be any big announcements. But I believe, Brian, you've been told something slightly different.
Well, we're being told that he's going to announce something to do with a change in schools, or at least school terms, and the possibility of another major lockdown coming in from the beginning of November. Now, this is simply passed to us as comment. We pay attention to everything that people send to us, and over the years we've been operating, we've had these little tip-offs that have become true. So we'll say to people, if you are in contact with people who are working at the Westminster end and you've got information, or indeed you're inside the parties themselves, please will you tell us more?
Boris will be giving a briefing with the two scientific advisors there. What are the numbers? As of 9 a.m. yesterday, another 7,143 cases in inverted commas. What that means is positive tests. 71 more people have died within 28 days of testing positive for COVID-19. So of course they're being put down as COVID deaths, whether or not they are COVID deaths. And that brings the total to 42,072. Although some people are suggesting that it's a bigger number, around 57,900. This is going to be the 100th live stream that Boris, or at least the government, has done. So that's something to cheer, I suppose. He's expected to speak after 5 p.m. Now, of course, what's going on in the rest of the country? Empty streets, of course, because, let's start with Wales. As from 6 p.m. On Thursday, Denbighshire, Flintshire, Conwy, Wrexham, people will be banned from mixing indoors with other households. They'll not be allowed to enter or leave those areas, so they have to stay within their locality without a reasonable excuse, such as work or education. But travel will be permitted through those areas to avoid cutting off other areas. So that is going to affect 500,000 people, and that brings the total number of people in Wales under lockdown to over 2 million. I think it's about 2.3 million. Then, of course, we've got, Liverpool. Well, Liverpool's been getting a bit of press over the last few days because, of course, the curfew in pubs has been 10 p.m, but the people of Liverpool haven't been terribly happy about that, so they've been bailing out of the pubs at the end of the evening and continuing the party out on the streets. That's not good enough, says the mayor. So Liverpool is only days away from what is being one of these circuit breaker 2-week local lockdowns. So the mayor was speaking to the Daily Telegraph. He said, "For me, it's only a matter of time because the virus isn't able to be controlled in the city with the restrictions we have now. If we can have the severest measures of lockdown now, we may arrest the increase and start to bring it down by the end of October so that in the lead up to Christmas, we can get some normality." So people being blackmailed by Christmas. And then, of course, we have the bungling Boris's announcement of the Northeast, which he wasn't able to get right, and he wasn't able to express what he meant by the rule of 6 with respect to the Northeast. But that's Northumberland, Newcastle, Gateshead, North and South Tyneside, Sunderland and Durham, those restrictions came into force at midnight last night. So threats of fines for people that insist on not following the rules.
Yeah, so the threats being really pushed, Mike. There was some dissent, I think, from local councillors in the Northeast who said that lockdown had come in, but nobody had bothered to talk to them. So this is getting very interesting because we got regionalisation of the country and the city-states that you talk about, but the government at the moment doesn't even want to bother talking to them. It's a diktat straight from Westminster. And perhaps we should just remind people that we've got 4 key elements to what's going on here. We've got the fusion doctrine that you've talked about. We've got the collaboration hub, which is this secretive unit inside government, which is ensuring that a policy that's spoken of one day is enacted on the street as fast as possible. Some MPs are now picking up that bills are being introduced on a Sunday, and we're seeing things move very quickly to implementation on the ground. So we've got fusion, we've got the collaboration hub, we've got the use of malicious political applied behavioural psychology, which is coming through the behavioural insights team, and of course the SAGE unit itself, that's very dangerous. And the next one to add is the BBC, and I think we should have a little film clip here. Let's look at what the BBC is talking about and how they talk about it.
Good morning, welcome to Breakfast with Louise Minchin and Dan Walker.
Our headlines for you at 6 o'clock. The number of people who have died as a result of the coronavirus pandemic around the world reaches 1 million.
Stations, deserted city centres. Have you been told to avoid the office?
We are live from the home of Tranmere Rovers this morning, who, like many lower league clubs, face an uncertain future.
And the Lake District could become home to the world's first paramedic. Look at this.
Good morning from Ham House, where we're going to be talking about edible flowers.
The number of people across the world who've died with coronavirus has passed 1 million, according to the tally kept by Johns Hopkins University in the United States.
America, Brazil and India account for nearly half of that total. More than 33 million people have been infected by COVID since it emerged in China at the end of last year. Here's John McManus with more.
It's been less than a year since the first cases of what became known as COVID-19 were first identified in Wuhan in China. The entire city was put into lockdown, and the pictures of the measures adopted by the authorities to halt the virus's spread flew around the world. Now the number of deaths globally has hit 1 million. The number of confirmed infections is more than 33 million. The worst hit country? The United States, followed by Brazil and India. With more than 42,000 deaths, the UK is the fifth most affected country, though each government calculates its figures differently.
This is a somber moment when we realise not just the scale of the tragedy, but the number of personal tragedies that are accompanying that number. It's for everyone who's died, they've left a family, they've left a loved one, they've possibly destroyed people have lost their livelihoods as a result. So the scale of the tragedy is even bigger than that staggering number.
And as transmission rates continue to rise in some parts of the UK,
Right, I would say straight off that we did a little bit of editing on that Breakfast BBC clip in order to shorten it, but we've certainly not taken out any extra information because there certainly wasn't any. But what have we got? We've got the BBC simply declaring that we're in this immense pandemic. They're ramping up the fear by commenting on the fact that now over 1 million people have died worldwide. We'll have a look at the significance of that. And whilst they're ramping up the fear over a worldwide pandemic, they introduce such amazing subjects as football and eating flowers and men who are going to be flying paramedics. Now we're going to suggest that what the BBC is doing there is deliberately playing with people's minds. You're frightening them on one hand with these unproven statistics, and then on the other hand you're pushing in little snippets which are going to confuse people essentially. So why do we need to be talking about football when the danger is supposedly deaths from COVID? Why do we need to be talking about eating flowers when we're talking about deaths from COVID? So this was an amazing BBC clip. There was no factual evidence put in there to support anything they were saying, certainly over COVID, and you were just presented with what is essentially a propaganda piece. This could have come straight out of North Korea. Just the government's view on what is happening with the pandemic. So let's have a look at some of the things that the BBC did show in that clip. So this is the first one. We should all be terribly frightened, Mike. There's 1 million deaths worldwide and 33 million infections. But just one source for this claim from Johns Hopkins University. The BBC didn't interview anybody. The BBC didn't put any other sources of information up. Just these headlines clearly designed to give people the fear factor.
Well, that's right. But of course, that number, that Johns Hopkins University has collated that from national governments. And if we look at the way that our national government has collated its figures and the terms of what on which they have decided that somebody has died of COVID rather than with COVID, we find that our figures in this country are utterly unreliable. None of the figures from other governments can be considered reliable either, in my view.
Right, so you've brought out analysis there. None of that analysis on the BBC. Straight statements of information which is not proven as factually correct is given out by the BBC as if it is correct. What else did the BBC do in that propaganda piece? Well, of course, they had this as part of the video clip. So 1 million COVID deaths, here is that being rammed into people's minds. And of course, what is the backdrop? The backdrop is video clip that hospitals can't cope. Hospitals are overwhelmed with COVID, when we know that throughout the UK, that is not true and was not true during the heat of the crisis, because NHS staff were saying that wards were empty and that the NHS was simply not providing treatment that it normally does. Here's the next bit, the BBC essentially praising the Chinese for their response, even though what the Chinese was doing was so bizarre that nobody could really understand it. This is one of the trucks that went round simply spraying vast quantities of dangerous disinfectant in the air, as if this was going to challenge a virus in a city. So the BBC just presents this to the audience as though it's factually of some significance, but in fact we're actually watching pure nonsense. And then we get the changed reality from the BBC, because of course we have a clip and comment, brief comment, oh, you're working from home. That's all normal now, is essentially what the BBC was saying. You're going to be working from home. That's the way it is. You should just really get on with it. So BBC utterly presenting the government's line. I'll put up the lady with the football again, because of course the BBC loves this. If you want to preoccupy people, you're either going to give them well, it'll be sex, I suppose, from the BBC and dark, unpleasant drama, or you're going to push football. But this was part of their morning report, but thrown in with the fact you've got to be very frightened of the COVID deaths. So we're going to say this is applied behavioural psychology by the BBC. This is applied cognitive dissonance, and it fits totally with the fact that the British government has boasted since 2010 that it can change the way people think and behave using applied behavioural psychology, and we won't know it's being done. Well, we're going to say we do know it's being done, and we're going to continue to warn people about it. So what the BBC didn't do is any sums. I hope we've got this one correct, but we simply took the million as a proportion of the world's population, and what you're saying is roughly 0.01282% of people have died. Is that of great significance? We say no. This was how the BBC put the top death countries, and there's your 42,000, Mike, at the bottom, that the BBC is saying we should be very worried about, and those have come, as you say, from Johns Hopkins University. I took this one from Our World in Data. This is world deaths in 2017, and we can see clearly at the top of the screen that cardiovascular diseases, with 17.79 million people dying in 2017, and cancers 9.56 dying, puts COVID well down the pot, in fact right down here, just above HIV and AIDS. So there's no reason for the population to be worried. But of course the BBC isn't interested in world heart disease, cancer or respiratory disease. Why is that? Well, of course, what they're doing is using applied psychology to get the government's agenda into the hearts and minds of the population.
Well, we will be commenting a bit more on that particular issue in 1 second, because it's actually extremely important as we move into this winter period and the narrative that is beginning to be built around this issue of heart disease, cancer, respiratory disease. Let's talk about that in a moment.
Right. We've got some comments about no graphics. I'm not quite sure what that is. I believe those images should have come up on screen okay. They are very small, but you can check this out yourself by going to Our World in Data, where there is a great deal of statistics and data about the world and diseases and deaths in particular. Now, this man spoke in the BBC clip, Alexander Matthew from the British Red Cross, This is part of what he said, and I was just interested in a small piece where he stuttered. He said, "This is a somber moment when we realise not just the scale of the tragedy of COVID, but the number of personal tragedies that are accompanying that number. For everyone who has died, they've left a family, a loved one. They've possibly destroyed people have lost their livelihoods as a result." When you hear that pause, that stutter in what he's saying at that point, that's nothing to do with editing by the UK column. That was in the original BBC clip. And it was if he was starting to say that as a result of the policies taken, people's lives have been destroyed, but then he corrects himself and goes back on script. Encourage people to go and have a listen to that because it's very strange.
Okay, now of course one of the big things that happened over the first wave of the pandemic, if we can use that term, was that the government bought a load of ventilators. Well, the National Audit Office has now released a report into their investigation in how government increased the number of ventilators available to the NHS in response to COVID-19. So if you want to see the full report, that's what you need to search for. So thousands of ventilators bought to treat COVID-19 patients, but unfortunately most of them are still sitting in warehouses because of a lack of demand. So the Cabinet Office and the Department for Health started ventilator programs. Each of them started their own ventilator programs on the basis that getting as many mechanical ventilators as possible, as quickly as possible, was necessary to safeguard public health, is what the National Audit Office has been saying. So they prioritised speed over cost, and that means that they paid quite a bit over the normal price. So let's have a look at some of the details of this then. So first of all, £569 million spent on ventilators that have never been switched on, Brian, largely. That was through the programme set up by the Department for Health and Social Care and also the separate programme set up by the Cabinet Office. That means that as of August, they had acquired 30,000 ventilators. That includes 9,100 already available to the National Health Service, 2,600 purchased by the Department of Health, and 12,300 built through the Cabinet Office's Ventilator Challenge programme. And then as of September, just a few days ago, around 2,150 of those 30,000 have been dispatched to the NHS. The rest are sitting in warehouses, unused, never switched on. We don't even know whether they work. And this apparently, this is because the anticipated demand did not materialise.
My response to that, Mike, is if Tobias Ellwood is saying what we've just seen him say, which is we now need to get the military involved, but the government can't even handle an order for ventilators on this scale, that is culpable failure in government, a role in a civil servant. If they can't sort out ventilators, never mind whether we should have used them or not, if they can't sort them out, we can't trust them on anything else they say around COVID.
Well, but they did sort them out in the sense that they ended up buying 30,000 of the things, but they never delivered them because they were never needed.
Well, if they were never needed, we know that they're lying over the whole thing.
Absolutely. So the cost then, well, it was an extra £10,000 for each ventilator compared to the normal price of a ventilator. Now, you could argue that companies that weren't normally manufacturing ventilators designed ventilators, and therefore there would be an additional cost in research and development, and they did it very quickly. So that's certainly the case, but nonetheless, the justification isn't really there. So the Department of Health, out of that 500 million, the Department of Health spent 292 million. Of course, we've got to add VAT onto this, and the Cabinet Office spent 277 million plus VAT. And that, of course, nobody is questioning, other than a couple of headlines that I saw asking why these things were still sitting in warehouses.
Yeah, well, the UK column's reporting it, Mike, luckily.
Absolutely. So where does that take us? Well, here's the Nhs Confederation. Well, they are very concerned about what they're calling the Nhs Triple Whammy. So what is that then? The Triple Whammy is COVID-19, a backlog, and reduced capacity due to infection control measures. Now, of course, what the Confederation, the NHS Confederation, is doing is demanding extra cash for the NHS, but they're not making any particular statement about how this situation has arisen. So they reported to NHS England. They said that more investment was desperately needed. They said that ministers need to be honest and realistic about waiting lists for treatment. So what are the waiting lists? Well, currently 2 million patients have waited longer than 18 weeks for treatment. This is the highest number since records began in 2007. Half the number of routine operations are only half the number of normal routine operations are being done now today. So even though over the summer there's been a massive decline in hospitalizations and beds required for treating COVID-19, the NHS has not been redeployed to dealing with the backlog because they're still only doing half the number of routine operations that they normally would be doing. Cancer care is running at about 3/4 capacity at this point in time when there's no other demand on the care system. Once the normal respiratory demands start coming on the care system in the winter, this is going to cause problems once again. So COVID-19, the backlog and reduced capacity due to infection control measures, this is the result of policy. It's not a result of the failure of the NHS that they aren't actually capable of providing the service, but the policy has been decided that the NHS will reorient in one direction alone to the detriment of everything else. And so effectively, the NHS has been switched off to a large degree. That hasn't been resolved over the summer. It's only going to get worse again in the winter. And the government is going to push this narrative as we head into the winter that we've got to start protecting the NHS again. And a national lockdown, I think, in the run up to Christmas is inevitable.
The government destroys the NHS with these policies and then puts out BBC propaganda that we've got to support the NHS, otherwise it's going to collapse. Policy designed to make it collapse.
Yes. Yes.
And I was given some statistics this morning about the number of women who've not been able to get breast screening as a result of these failures in the NHS. It's extremely high. I will check on that figure and bring it out on Monday.
Okay, so yesterday then Boris announced, well, he was in Devon, he was in Exeter. Brian, we could have run up the road and said hello to him, but sadly we didn't. But Boris has set out plans to transform the training and skills system. He's going to make it fit for the 21st century economy, but the 21st century economy is all fourth industrial revolution, it's robotics and so on. We're not going to be using, we don't need brickies for that kind of thing because all this stuff's going to happen automatically. But he's clearly extremely skilled himself there.
So the country's being shut down. We can't look after people in the hospitals. We've got the police out of control in some areas, and Boris Johnson is getting out the propaganda that he's been to visit a local college.
Right. So basically what he's announced is that, well, currently people under the age of 23 qualify for fully funded qualifications at a technical level, which is equivalent to A-level or a bit higher than that. So now he's rolling this out to the rest of the population. If you don't have an A-level qualification, you can go and get some training at a college. They haven't announced what the range of training that's going to be available is yet, but this is going to be available after April. But what's really at the heart of this? Well, higher education loans will also be made more flexible so that you can get one of those. But I suspect that this is mainly about keeping people off the jobless figures. It's an accounting exercise more than anything else. Yes, okay, they're going to spend a little bit of money, which might support some of the further education and technical colleges that exist around the country. But really, I'm not seeing anything from the government which is demonstrating that the economy is going to be able to support the people that are trained in this way. Yeah. So it's a short-term measure, it seems, to keep people off the unemployment statistics.
Yeah, cynical effort too.
Yes.
Well, we'd like to say thank you to our viewers and listeners. Over the last few months in particular, we've got a greatly increased engagement with you all. A lot of information coming in, a lot of very good emails. So I've just pulled out a couple. This is back to the subject of talking about the Trafalgar Square protest. As I understand it, their cadres, this is talking about the police, have been deployed on the streets of Paris during the Gilets jaunes protests. Sorry, this is talking about the EU police, the Catalan independent protests, and have a remit that allows them to also operate in affiliated nation. They've further been deployed in Afghanistan, the Balkans and the African continent, deployments which have been posted in their official website. I was a police officer trained in PSU tactics and deployed on public order duty, but in my time in that role, I can never recall ever being deployed to attack harmless civilians in the way those Metropolitan Police PSU officers were last Saturday. Now, I think these emails carry some weight because people, professional people, retired, who are now looking back and saying they don't like what's going on. It goes on to say, I've worked alongside Met officers when my force lent mutual aid to other forces, and although there were the occasional big hitter types who thrive on wanting to crack a few heads, and I can say not all of those sentiments are exclusive to the Met. For the most part, I believe that any right-thinking current or former police officer would be horrified by what went down last week. The deployment of batons is a separate and quite thorny issue. However, when to deploy and use the baton is a matter of officer discretion, and head strikes are never encouraged unless it's under extremely serious, life-threatening circumstances, none of which were apparent in the stills and video I saw in your programme or in other social media reports. Regards, Will. We did actually get a full name, but we've decided to cut that to Will. But really good to see that these professional people are now responding to the UK column reports. Let's go on a bit here. And I'm sorry, I've probably, what's the word? I've just mixed up the opening of these two emails. So the first one that we've just covered was to do with the specialist police units. And now we're into the subject of Euro Gen 4. This one says, after watching Monday's broadcast, particularly the coverage of the last Saturday's peaceful protest in Trafalgar Square, the subsequent police action and the description of police officers of Eastern European appearance, might they have been Euro Gen 4? Okay, so we don't know, but we're very interested in what people have to say. Now, this is very, very interesting. We're taking these as genuine emails, and I have spoken to the Met Police earlier today to see whether we can get confirmation, but let's see what we were given. This is an email that was sent to Cressida Dick. We're sending you a video that was captured during peaceful protests in London yesterday. In the video, the massed lines of police appeared to charge at the peaceful protesters in an unprovoked manner, knocking one man unconscious. And there's then a link through to information on a Facebook page. As usual, this did not make the mainstream news. We do not support the language used against the police by the person in the video. Could you give me an opinion why this happened in a peaceful protest in a democratic country? We're fully supportive of the police upholding the law, but this behaviour is not acceptable in our eyes. Now, what was nice about this email to Cressida Dick is it's very simple, it's short, it's measured, it's polite. Let's have a look at the response that came back. So, good morning. Thank you for your email. I apologise for the delay in responding. It's been an unusually busy period. In the reference to the events in Trafalgar Square on the 19th of September, the legislation provides exemption from the COVID restrictions to political organisations engaged in peaceful and organised protests, as long as they submit proper risk assessments and have sensible safety precautions in place. In the case of this protest, the risk assessment was not endorsed by the local authority, which made the assembly unlawful. Officers repeatedly attempted to persuade the organisers and those involved to disperse in line with the national 4 E's: engage, encourage, explain, enforce. policy, but we were met with extreme hostility and violence when doing so. As a consequence, those officers were required to use force. Officers are required to individually justify every use of force in the course of their duties. And this is the best bit. Whilst the right to peaceful and lawful protest is a fundamental democratic right to be respected, the level of violence directed at the officers on the day was wholly disproportionate and utterly unacceptable. Thank you for your email to the Commissioner's private office. Kind regards, Dave Blair, Staff Officer to the Commissioner. Now, we're taking these emails as true. We have taken the steps to try and speak to the Met Police, and in particular to speak to this gentleman. So we're going to say at the moment this is an alleged response from him, but I think it's one that requires us to think very carefully, because we've seen 2 demonstrations in Trafalgar Square. In both of them, it went from peaceful interaction with the police to the police acting in a very brutal manner. But this man says, well, the trouble was it was you nasty civilians caused the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just clarify, when you say that both emails are true, I think you mean genuine, because of course his email was lies from start to finish. It looks at least at first view, because I have yet to see any video from last weekend that demonstrated a level of violence directed at the officers which was wholly disproportionate and utterly unacceptable. There was no violence until that crowd was charged, and the violence came from the police.
That's absolutely right, Mike, and this is why we wanted to make sure we're absolutely correct on these emails. If you send in emails to us, it is helpful that you actually give us the transmission data so that we can see that those emails have gone to and fro. But I believe by the language used in these 2 texts, these are genuine emails, and we will be sending an email to the Met this afternoon asking some further comments about this exchange.
Okay, if you like what the UK Column does and you would like to support us, then please head over to ukcolumn.org/community, and there are options to help us out there. And just briefly, just before we came on air, Ian Crane sent me a message to say that tickets for AV 11.1 would be available by the end of play today. So for Friday's news programme, we'll have details of speakers and so on. But if you want to find out more, probably best to have a look at in the morning at alternativeview.co.uk.
Yeah.
Okay, what's next then? Well, talk radio, and let's have a look at this, because Mark Dolan cuts up his face mask live on air is what talk radio was tweeting out a week or so ago, or well, actually, sorry, at the start of the month, September the 4th. If you want to save lives and get the country back on track, the only option is to get back to normal. The first step to achieving that is binning these wretched masks. Well, in fact, he said a little bit more than that. He said these wretched, god-awful, damned, blinking, uncomfortable, scientifically empty, useless masks. Well, Ofcom received 36 complaints about Mark Dolan's programme on the 4th of September, and most of these were accusing him of making irresponsible comments made on the use of face masks. So 36 complaints on that. And I just thought we would just remember, of course, there are 24,500 complaints on the issue of Black Lives Matter propaganda on Britain's Got No Talent, or whatever it's called. So, of course, Ofcom decided that there was no case to answer in the case of Diversity's dance on Britain's Got Talent. And so we wait to see what happens with these complaints to Ofcom over Mark Dolan's comments about face masks, and see whether see what the response is there.
So everything people are doing at the moment to ask for these risk assessments on the wearing of face masks, this is definitely having an impact, because we're now seeing that the state is getting panicky. And I think your next segment is going to reinforce that, actually.
Well, I mean, if anybody, if assuming everybody agrees with what Brian said earlier about the BBC and so on, and their lack of taking in any alternative narratives, well, the situation isn't going to get any better under the new Director General. Here he is, Tim Davey. He was given evidence by video link to the Culture, Media and Sport, Digital Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee yesterday. Well, what was he saying? if anybody that's working for the BBC, if they want to work for the BBC, they could be told to suspend their Twitter accounts. He said, where we're able to take disciplinary action, where we're able to take people off Twitter, I know people want to see hard action on this. If people want to work for the BBC, they could be told to suspend their accounts. He said that he was prepared to take the appropriate disciplinary action all the way to termination for those that breach impartiality rules. And of course, when we're talking impartiality with respect to the BBC, that means BBC impartiality, which means nobody with an alternative narrative is allowed to get a word in edgeways.
Yeah.
He said that news and current affairs would have a high bar for impartiality, that there's a certain standard expected of all BBC staff. However, I don't think this is about banning people on social media, by the way. We must be out there, he says, so long as they're giving the correct narrative. And he went on to say, if you want to be an opinionated columnist or a partisan campaigner on social media, then that's a valid choice, but you shouldn't be working for the BBC.
Yeah, so propaganda machine complete. It's so complete that you can't have any other opinion. You can only agree to the BBC line, otherwise you can't work there. When he says terminate, I presume that's terminate the job, Mike, because you had me really worried for a moment that perhaps he was going for a very, very curt solution. More trouble in schools, and this has come into the UK column, and I think it's very significant. Two mums discussing what's been happening with children at school. Absolutely furious. Myself and two other parents, also on here, this Facebook, have been informed by our children that a presentation was held at their senior school today. Some of it was acted out by teachers in sketches. The children were told not to listen to any fake news about masks and not to believe anything unless it's on BBC or Sky News. Anything shared on social media is conspiracy theories and should be ignored, even if it's claimed from scientists. They showed a video of people talking about things like masks don't work, they're just a mind control trick, and said that was the kind of people they were talking about. Apparently they said anyone who thinks like that are far-right extremists and terrorists, and if you think like that, you're a terrorist. My daughter's own words to me were that it was brainwashing, Mum, total brainwashing. And just to finish this off, the school told the children that if they hear anyone talking like that or hear things like that talked about at home, then they should report it to the Student Support Services or to the National Counter-Terrorism Office. They actually said to them, if anyone in your family has a minority view that the mainstream don't share, then they are far right. One of the teachers decided to take it one step further and tell her class that everyone should take the vaccines as they are perfectly safe. Nice to know she clearly has information about something that not even top scientists are aware of, as it's not even been produced yet, as far as I'm aware. We're all fuming. If ever there was a case of brainwashing, indoctrination and far-right ideology, then this looks like it to me. So fascinating to read that, Mike, after your statement there by the boss of the BBC. You can't have a social media account because that makes you a right-wing terrorist. And we just remind people of the 30th of May, 2019. This was the Express. Patriotism is a sign of racism and right-wing extremism, the British Army document claims. And this was a matrix document. We did show it at the time, but it was indicators and warnings for extreme right-wing people. And we referred to this. Extremists and right-wing people refer to political correctness as some left-wing or communist plot. They make inaccurate generalizations about the left or the government. And down the bottom, they involve colleagues in closed social media groups. So this agenda is real. It's been pushed around at the heart of the government for many years, and indeed into the military. The same military, Mike, that we're now starting to see unleashed on the British streets.
Yes. Now, in the meantime, of course, the attack on veterans continues. So this is the Sun. Pursuit ends. This is really good news, according to the Sun. No more British soldiers to face prosecution over bloody Sunday killings almost 50 years ago after £200 million public inquiry. And the Sun saying prosecutors said they will take no further action against 15 British paratroopers in connection with the deaths of 13 civil rights marchers in 1972. The decision not to prosecute follows a year-long review, multiple investigations and a decade-long public inquiry which cost £200 million. Soldier F, the only soldier to face charges, will continue to face trial, but 15 former paratroopers who were reinvestigated last year will not be prosecuted, the Public Prosecution Service of Northern Ireland said. And the Public Prosecution Service of Northern Ireland added, apparently, the test for prosecution was not met on evidential grounds. Now, this is important because, of course, if you were watching the first David Ellis report, Lawfare, which was out on the 30th of July, David was speaking to Nhs Hutchings, who is himself facing an attempted murder charge in Northern Ireland over events that took place while he was deployed over there as a 21-year-old or whatever it was. Now, the point that Nhs Hutchings was making is that there are actually 200 or 300 former serving military personnel facing the potential for prosecutions, not just these 15 or 16 with respect to Bloody Sunday. And so what we have here is one man being prosecution continuing on that, 15 others prosecution not continuing. And what the effect that seems to be having is that many people within the veterans community that are potentially facing prosecution are reluctant to speak up at this point because they're perhaps hopeful that they will not see this regime continue to a point where they are in court themselves. So it's absolutely divide and conquer effort here
of the vets,
of the veterans, and they do need support. So I would encourage that. But do watch David Ellis's programme and share that if you haven't seen it yet.
We'll just add why the government so frightened of the veterans in this country, because as a group of people, they're into millions of people plus their families, and the government know that veterans have an inherent sense of right and wrong. And the government of occupation is worried those veterans are going to see through the malicious policies that are coming into place. So I think this divide and rule of the veterans is another malicious policy from Boris's government, Mike.
Absolutely. Now, are we going to war? Well, maybe this gives us a clue. This is Air Force magazine in the United States. Headline is, with an eye on China, Reaper drones train for maritime war. So what they're saying is MQ-9 Reapers, a workhorse drone of America's 2 decades counter-terrorism fight in the Middle East and Africa, want to show they're getting a second wind. And it goes on to talk about the fact that Reapers are old technology, that they're not viewed by the US military as being the front line or the top technology anymore. And so this particular group who are flying these aircraft are trying to justify their existence. So they're trying to refocus on the Pacific arena. So they're saying it incorporates maritime interdiction capabilities, it incorporates a lot more major contingency operation capabilities, air interdiction, it reinvigorates our strike coordination and reconnaissance capability, and it also increases our combat search and rescue capabilities. So they're trying to justify their existence, but they've been criticized that perhaps it's too old to really face off against Russia and China. So what did they decide to do? Well, you won't be able to see that particularly well in that image, but if you look on their arms, they've got patches there. Well, the Chinese, as anybody would imagine, took a bit of offense at this, and they are starting to ask, is the US military suggesting that it is preparing for war with China? Because the patch shows the military, the Reaper drone, flying over China rather than over the Middle East. So that is it flying over China with the crosshairs on China.
And with a death head, am I looking at
yes,
that?
absolutely.
Right.
Yes,
So if this was the badge for, from Nazi Germany, we'd be shouting, my goodness, this is the SS squads in action. And yet we've got a death's head badge imposed over the top of a nation state.
Yes, indeed. So, on one hand, you might say, well, this is a squadron that's trying to justify its existence and and the optics, they're saying that they are capable of dealing with China. But on the other hand, this exercise and everything that went with this exercise was given approval by the US Air Force, and therefore that includes the badge that these guys wore. So the intention here is absolutely clear, and I think the Chinese are probably right to be a bit offended by it.
Yeah, I would say so.
But don't worry, Brian, because even if we end up in war with China, we have Exercise Joint Warrior going on, which is being led by HMS Queen Elizabeth. So our aircraft carrier is out in the sea with its F-35s. They're practicing with them this week, and so we don't need to worry about the Chinese at all.
How many aircraft are on board? I've forgotten. About 6, is it, or 7?
Yes, and those are mostly US aircraft as well.
Certainly were. We need to do a bit of checking up on that.
No, they still are. So this is Exercise Joint Warrior. It's taking place for 11 days off the coast of northwest Scotland, and 11 nations, 6,000 personnel, 81 aircraft. Not all of them are F-35s, of course. 28 ships, 2 submarines. UK, USA, Netherlands, Portugal, Belgium, Canada, France, Denmark, Norway, and Lithuania. I'm sure the Chinese are probably shaking in their boots.
It's incredible, isn't it? But luckily there's enough troops still to fight COVID as well. So
absolutely.
Okay, well, we better end there. Thank you to our viewers and listeners for joining us. We're in very serious times. If you're an overseas viewer, you can see that Boris Johnson's government of occupation has destroyed democracy in UK. Serious things coming now by the day. How can we stop it? Exposure, and get challenging those people in authority who are finally showing signs of waking up. And I'll just say a big thank you to our audience in America. We know you're there, we know you're growing in different parts of the country, but thank you for the communication. Thank you also to people living in Italy who are now in contact with us. So it's very interesting to see these communications come in. Thanks for joining us. We will be back at the same time on Friday. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.